Well, hey there, gang. It is Tony again with Unpacking Dieselpunk, and I am so glad that you are with me on this episode. You know, this episode we are going to get into a very interesting question that has to do with magic and the occult. Okay. Let's go ahead and get into the question. But before we get into it, you know, I always like to at least introduce or reintroduce my favored definition of Dieselpunk so that we can all be on the same page, or at least you can see where I'm coming from when I talk about Dieselpunk and its origins, or rather its foundation. So the definition that I like about Dieselpunk is that Dieselpunk is a method of creativity that combines the historic style of the mid-1910s to the mid-1950s with elements of sci-fi, fantasy, or even horror. So that's my favorite definition, and I love to always get your feedback as far as what you think about that definition. The goal of this is really to just kind of simplify the genre of Dieselpunk, which we love so well, to make it really easy to understand. So I hope that helps. So the question that I am going to entertain today, now here's why this is really already starting off as being weird, because I saw the question, I was ready to go ahead and tackle the question, and I always like to attribute who asked the question, and for the life of me, I can't see who the person is that asked the question. I've got it here in my notes. I got a couple people who I think it is, but I usually have that name right there. So this is weird. This question just came out of nowhere. Actually, I'm sure it didn't. So please forgive me if this is your question. Please post a comment and raise your hand. Please do that if this is your question. Otherwise, this will be a mysterious question that we don't know where it came from. So the question says, if such a thing exists in a given setting, what kind of magic/occult powers fits the most in the Dieselpunk style? And cool question, because it reinforces what we've talked about, and especially many of you, like my friend Evelyn and a few others, have asked the question about, does Dieselpunk always have to involve war? And others have asked, you know, does Dieselpunk always tie into, you know, World War II or the Nazis? And not necessarily. In fact, part of what we talk about is that it can have elements of fantasy. That leads into horror, and that may have those elements of what's exactly being asked with this question here about magic and the occult. And where does it best fit into Dieselpunk? So I pondered the question myself, and when I gave it a little bit of thought, and I want to get your feedback, what you think about this, I think the best way to incorporate those elements into the Dieselpunk genre is, especially since Dieselpunk is based on history, to start with the real world, or to start with real world history, and then expand into the fantastic. So start within the real world, find elements within history where the occult was something that was prevalent, or talks about those types of things were maybe prevalent in history, and then take a spin on it, or then kind of expand it. And that's where I think it really best fits. Now, give you an example, especially when it came to, I was thinking about the question itself, and one of the things that were taking place in history that actually was in the Dieselpunk history, especially in the closer to the 1910s or the middle of the 1910s era, is there were mediums and their debunkers. Mediums or psychics or people that were doing seances, and then there was a big movement of those that were trying to debunk them. Now, my friend John Pica is really probably on top of this, because he knows he's a magician himself, and he's a great follower of Harry Houdini. And many of you that follow the life of Harry Houdini know that part of his historical career was made on debunking the mediums of that day. And he actually started doing this, I think, well, his career started really around the turn of the century. But as you get into the 1910s, he still was actively made a career out of debunking mediums and people that were getting folks together and doing seances, and he made it his passion, his mission, to prove them to be false. Now, that is a historical thing that had taken place within the Dieselpunk era. And I'd say where it fits great is just to, many kind of stories and art and things like that, especially movies and novels, can be written by using that as a foundation because it was a historical foundation. But put a twist on it. Make some of that stuff real and go down that road. But that's where I think it can really fit, especially when it comes to magic and the occult. Another thing, and many of you are familiar with this because it is one of the foundations of how the whole Indiana Jones franchise started with Raiders of the Lost Ark, is Hitler and the Nazis and their push for or their ties to the occult and things along that line. That has some historical facts and background to it, and so one could expand upon that because it took place within the Dieselpunk era. It actually has historical foundation to it, and then put that twist on it, just like they did with Raiders of the Lost Ark. Perfect example of taking where the occult and magic and those things can best fit within the Dieselpunk era. There were rumors, and some of those rumors have been proven true, that Hitler and the Nazis had true interest in things of the occult, and they were looking for artifacts and things like that. So Spielberg and those folks did base the story of Indiana Jones and Raiders of the Lost Ark off of those historical things and made a great franchise from that. So I hope that answered your question. Whoever you are that asked that question, please post a comment and raise your hand. Forgive me for not having your name here on my notes, but I hope the question didn't come out of thin air. So post your comment. And especially speaking about posting your comments, I have a new finished print, an 11x17 that I am signing and will give to you. But the way that you have to enter to get it is you have to post a question. So please post one of your questions right here at the bottom of this post, at the bottom of this video. If you're listening audibly, go back and post your question there, and you will be in the running for the skydivers. Many of you have been following me while we were on the Portsmouth Aeroship Building Company, and you saw me in the progression of putting this together. It is now finished, and I want it to be yours. So post a question and we will get to have you in the running. So let's take on one last question, and I want to take that question on from my friend Roberto. Roberto, thank you, sir, for posting this question. And Roberto asked a personal question, and this is very cool because I do want to kind of give you some insight on how I got here with my passion for Dieselpunk. And so Roberto's question is, what inspired me to dive into Dieselpunk like I have? And I gave that question a lot of thought, Roberto, and I kind of reflected on it. And it's kind of a few things that have caused me to have a passion for Dieselpunk like I have. But I'll start off with, I believe my history and growing up is where the foundation of it actually began. I can remember as a young kid, probably as young as maybe 6 on up to when I was probably 10 or 12. Almost every Sunday we'd go to she was my Aunt B. I actually had an Aunt B, just like Andy from Mayberry. But every Sunday we'd always go over to her house for dinner. And one of the things I loved about being over there is she had a stack of photo albums. And those photo albums contain so many old photos especially from the 40s, which back then, this was in the 70s, so that was only about 30 years prior. But what was cool and what intrigued me about looking at those photos is because many of my older relatives, who like my aunt and her husband and all of that, were still with us right then and there, but I got to see them when they were younger back in the 40s in those photos. And so that was something that was really intriguing to me. But here's the thing that I love about the Dieselpunk era is because I think I'm so connected to it because I actually knew people that lived during that time frame. Me being a kid of the born in the 60s, growing up in the 70s, I actually had older relatives that grew up and lived during that time frame. So when I read about the history of the 1930s and the 1940s, not only can I read about it, but I actually was able to talk to people, my relatives, that lived it, and they were telling the most amazing stories that took place during World War II and leading up to World War II, and maybe even a little bit after. And these were people that I knew. And so that's one thing that made the Dieselpunk era real to me, because I've actually talked to people that lived it and went there. Interesting story. Whenever I always think about the bombing of Pearl Harbor, my Aunt B, again, she was a young lady during that time when it happened, and she recalls when it happened. And I think her and one of her boyfriends were at a movie theater in Portsmouth, Virginia, and when they got the news that Pearl Harbor had been attacked. And so this was really interesting, where history came to life. So that's one of the things that I think connects me with the Dieselpunk era. So I had that love for that era. And especially growing up watching those, this was kind of before cable really was mainstream, so you were limited in the different channels that you can look at. And so that meant that a lot of old movies from the 40s especially were something that I saw a lot of. And again, kind of being connected to those movies because I knew people that lived in that era of those old black and white movies, especially the war movies. And then the other thing I like about Dieselpunk is that it is a real cool twist on regular, let's say traditional sci-fi, where I love sci-fi just like many of you do, but then I see that there can be an interesting twist with that sci-fi where they go back in history. Even just certain movies, let's say for example the movie that I'm thinking of, yes, Fantastic Beasts and Where to Find Them. That movie could be done, especially with the special effects, in any era. But I love the fact that it took place back in the, if I'm not mistaken, the 20s. Yeah, it took place in the 20s. And so just having something like that with the fantasy, with that historical backdrop, is something that, again, I think is cool with sci-fi. So I hope that gives you some insight on why I love and I'm drawn to Dieselpunk and what made me kind of dive in deep. And there's even more to that I'll share in some future episodes. But you guys tell me about yourself. What drew you to Dieselpunk? Why do you love it so much? And Roberto, I'd like for you to post your insight on it as well too. And thank you for the question. Okay, I want to thank you for hanging with me on today. Remember, post your question, post it here, and then you will be in the running to get a signed copy of my latest print. It's an 11x17, and I hope that you enjoy it, but I would like to give it to you by you posting the question. And so on that note, we will see you on the next episode of Unpacking Dieselpunk. We'll see you soon.